Hey everyone, welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy, I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. Gotta say folks, I'm flying high. Our dear little dog Mabel had a mastectomy last week, and because she'd been having tumors pop up, and we got the biopsy results back, and she's cancer-free. Plus, I get my second vaccine tomorrow, so you know what? For the first time in the last year, I felt happy for more than 2 hours. Hey, but you know what else made me happy? Today's guest, it's Bob Nastanovich. If you don't know who Bob is, why don't I read you his bio right now? Born in Rochester, but raised in Richmond, Virginia, Bob Nastanovich spent the early part of his life playing tennis and listening to punk rock. While attending college at the University of Virginia, he met his future bandmates Steve Malkmus and Dave Berman, and the three formed the band Ectoslavia with future Yo La Tengo member James McNew. After college, the three moved to Jersey across from Manhattan, where the first Silver Jew songs were recorded. Malkmus formed Pavement around this time with his old friend Spiral Stairs, and Bob joined a little later, essentially as the utility player of the band. Though Pavement broke up in 1999, the band occasionally reunites for live shows, and since then, Bob has spent a lot of his time with his other passion, horse racing, as well as running the record label Broker's Tip Records. Okay, this is very exciting for me. I have made no bones on the show about saying how both Pavement and the Silver Jews are two of my favorite bands. And I was thinking, one of the things I loved about Pavement, and I kind of talk about it a little bit with Bob, but I mean, look, first of all, one of the things I love about them is that it's 3 decades later and their songs are still great. But the other thing is that they really redefined, especially to 14-year-old suburban Andy, what a band could be. Like, it truly blew my mind then that you could have more than one singer in a band, each writing songs. And obviously I had heard the Beatles, but like, I don't think it ever registered to me that all 4 of the Beatles were writing songs, because I was just listening to my parents' records, and this was before the internet. And I mean, I don't even know if I really understood that Pavement had 2 singers until I saw them at Lollapalooza. I was pretty dense as a kid. But anyway, the other thing that I thought, kind of blew my mind was that you could have someone like Bob who helps create this kind of like indescribable vibe, or he creates this different kind of energy that adds to the band on this subatomic level. So, I don't know. I thought it was really great to talk to him. He's a real good dude, and I hope you enjoy this episode. By the way, if you do, and you would like to check out other episodes, I've been doing this for 11 years. Now, you can, of course, wade through the back catalog, or I could suggest a couple now, based on the fact that you are listening to Bob Nastanovich. Maybe you would be interested in the fact that I also talked to Spiral Stairs. I've talked to Thurston Moore, Mary Timoney, Ian Mackay, Will Cullen Hart from Olivia Tremor Control, Mira, Colin Newman from Wire, Mac McCon, and hundreds of TV writers, actors, artists, filmmakers, and more. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Google, Stitcher. With the exception of Stitcher, basically if you are a giant tech company trying to find ways to make money off of podcasts, that's where you can find Beginnings, or pretty much any podcatcher of your choice. Got some great episodes coming up. Both Clay and Matt from Chavez, Isabel from Belle and Sebastian, and a bunch of other great episodes. So stay tuned for those. But for now, let's talk to Bob.
I was born in Rochester, and then at the age of 5 or 6, my family moved to Midlothian, Virginia, which is It's south of Richmond. It's basically back then it wasn't a suburb of Richmond, but now it definitely is. And like Amy Mann from Till Tuesday, she's from there.
Yeah.
Justin Verlander, the famous baseball pitcher, he's from Goochland, which is about 5 miles away from there. So yeah, basically South Richmond's where I spent a lot of my growing up years, like 6 to 17. Then I went to Charlottesville on my 18th birthday for university. So yeah, I was only in New York State. My mother, her family's from Central New York, Montour Falls, which is like not far from Watkins Glen, and my dad is from Metuchen, New Jersey. Hungarian family from exit 10 on the New Jersey Turnpike. Perth Amboy, Metuchen,
Yeah,
and
I do.
Yeah, so I come from like what you'd call a Yankee background, and but I pretty much grew up mainly in Virginia.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. So like you really like Virginia is probably like the place that actually formed you as a person, as opposed to like the first 5 or 6 years in Rochester.
Yeah, I did spend 2 years in Fairfield, Connecticut, and they were 2 great years, and that was 5th and 6th grade. I really loved those years. For one thing, when you played Little League Baseball in Virginia, the uniforms were these incredible thick polyester things with these huge waistbands that used to kind of give us all a rash. And then when I moved to Connecticut and played baseball, you could just play with jeans, and each team had a different colored t-shirt on. Yeah, but definitely Virginia. And my mother still lives there. My father did until he passed away in 2011. My sister still lives in the Richmond area with her husband and 3 kids. So home for me has always been Central Virginia, really.
Because I was going to say then like moving to Iowa, like I mean, the culture is different, but in terms of like, say, people who might be more politically to the right of you, it's not like Virginia isn't like that, right?
Well, I've always known loads of Republicans. I mean, when I went to a pretty small high school in Richmond, and there was, there was a Republican club, and obviously University of Virginia is loaded with conservative elements. I think they have the full spectrum of, political opinions at UVA, but in your face would be sort of like kind of a very right wing. Like, I would say there's a lot of guys that resemble Tucker Carlson and Justice Kavanaugh wandering around UVA. That seems to be like kind of like a bit of in your face. In fact, during the entire confirmation hearings of Justice Kavanaugh, like that was the first. And I mean, with George W. Bush, I felt like I've always known guys like that too. Kind of like thick, like friendly frat boy type guy, and then in the case of Kavanaugh, and I was a really good tennis player when I grew up. So was Stephen Malkmus. And I played in all the tournaments and stuff, and I was really competitive at tennis. But I played against a lot of guys like Kavanaugh, and they're the kind of guy that you just want to beat to a pulp and make them cry, So I got great pleasure out of making guys like that cry. But yeah, no, I've always had friends that from the other side of the aisle. You have to understand, my father worked in the Carter administration. My Aunt Louise was pretty sort of a higher up in the New York State Democratic Party for years, and I was completely raised a Democrat. I don't think they used to use the incredibly rude term libtard until the last 5 years. But no, I definitely was raised in a libtard environment. Yeah. So
what did your dad do?
It's very difficult for my mother. In fact, because she lives in an independent living facility now, which I think is probably about 90% plus Republican, like First Families in Virginia. It's like sort of like where they lay fairly wealthy people, and in some cases extremely wealthy people, out to pasture, as they say. My father, in the Carter administration, he was deputy assistant to Carter in the Office of Public Liaison. During his time at Rochester Telephone, he became very good friends with Midge Costanza, who was Carter's one of his biggest assistants. I guess Midge Costanza would roll over in her grave. She was the first lesbian that was assistant to the president, advisor to the president. She basically was the Jared Kushner of the Carter administration, and she actually brought in my father because her workload was so huge, and she actually didn't make the full term. My father actually was responsible for organizing and having, through Mitch's lead, but she left, having the first ever gay rights meeting in the White House. So I think he's who's who in America for that. But that was just sort of a brief stint in government for him. He essentially was a executive. Both my parents came from very poor backgrounds, and my father was pretty successful. I mean, my mother's family was very poor. There's 6 kids, and she was born in 1936, and she described situations in the 1940s where, like, once a month they would go to the other side of the lake and get a chicken and fry a chicken, and twice a month they'd go for ice cream, and I talked to her, I talked to her all the time, but I talked to her not too long ago about the polio era, because that was sort of the last time that our country dealt with something similarly. And since she had so many siblings, they would always just kind of stay in their yard and play during that era. Yeah.
So the same kind of lockdown as is going on right now.
I would think so. Do you have children?
No,
me neither. I don't know what that's sort of like. I grew up in a neighborhood where there was about 20 of us, and it was a very competitive group that came from, 8 to 12 houses, and we would play basketball, football, have acorn fights, do all kinds of, it was just one of those classic middle class neighborhoods with tons of backyards, and it was very competitive in that regard. Soccer, I remember we'd get so inspired by the Olympics that we would make our own track meets. And we made a high jump pit one time using as a landing pad bags of leaves. And unfortunately, my friend Bobby Morris missed the bags. And I think I was about 9 or 10 years old. And it was the first time I ever saw a compound fracture. His bone was sticking through the leg. And he went into shock and stuff like that. But it was probably the goriest thing that I saw before the age of 10. But yeah, we'd play kick the can, and then they we got the Magnavox Odyssey video game, which was really lame. The O'Toole family got the Atari 2600. They always had, there's 3 boys over there, and they were always, their finger was more on the pulse. They sort of had better stuff. But we had a basketball hoop in our backyard. Always had a basketball hoop. And my sister's she's 2 years and 2 months older. And she was cool, she still is, but she was a cool big sister. She was into cool stuff. So that helped me.
Yeah. So, it sounds like that we had somewhat similar kinds of childhoods where I grew up in this neighborhood called Laurel Springs in Reading, Pennsylvania. Yeah. And everything, there was a basketball court there. There was a pool. There was a neighborhood pool. There was, everyone played together. We all played basketball together. We all played football together. There was like this big, in between two, there was a whole neighborhood of like row homes. And so in between these two row homes, there was a big like field where you could play football.
Chris, sounds ideal. We would just play in yards. I think the O'Tooles would have had like the most abused yard of the group because I think they had like a pretty huge thing on the side of their house, which was kind of field like. But it was pretty tight. The other thing that was going on, which was rather interesting, is that I was friends with the Knappenberger boys, Chip and Tim, and their father took the old Broad Street train station in Richmond and made the Science Museum of Virginia, which is a fantastic museum. But as part of that process, when they went in to sort of excavate the old train station in downtown Richmond, they found a lot of beer cans underneath the like rubble in pristine condition, like the first beer cans of the 30s and 40s. And so we became avid beer can collectors. And at one point, and that was a thing back then. That was a thing like, I'm 53. So this is like around 1980. And that became kind of a fad. And we had a kind of a famous beer can collection. It was just like a consortium of like 6 to 8 teenagers. So I would spend a lot of time looking for beer cans. In Richmond, such an old city, you'd find some amazing things. And then my father really enjoyed it too, because there was this one beer store that had beers of the world, which of course is kind of a normal thing now, but it was kind of a really obscure thing back then. And because back then, like the grocery stores would just have, your domestics. They wouldn't have this. I mean, it's just incredible. Like the grocery store right next to my house here, just like the range of liquor, beer, and wine is just, it's scintillating, really. But no, so I would always buy all these cans, and he would open. If you're a beer can collector, you open the can from the bottom because it adds value to still have the ring pull on top. Uh-huh. So he was getting and I would buy. I mean, my mother would buy. I would give my mother money, and then so we had this. Anyways, that was another huge facet of mine growing up, was beer can collecting. Interestingly. And I'm sure you probably will ask me about that, so I don't want to jump the gun. But music playing music was not a thing. Nobody played music. My sister we'd listen to records. My father had records. In fact, when he did pass away almost a decade ago, I realized that underneath his bed, he had a lot of funk records that I was unaware of. He had like a bunch of Booker T and the MGs and Barry White. I didn't know his funk stylings, but he was just a classic like Happy Days type 50s guy, like Bill Haley and the Comets and stuff like that. And like my sister was cool. She was into the Pretenders and the Police and the Cars and stuff like that. And so I would say that she kind of got me listening to music like, 10, 11. And then she was the kind of sister that for some reason I thought I would cramp her style, but she would sort of drag me around to social events. I'm not really sure why. I don't think I would have done that if I had a younger sibling. But anyways.
Were you outgoing as a kid?
Yeah, pretty outgoing. Yeah, pretty much the same. I feel like I've always, and I've had a lot of friends that say, "Oh, I was way different back then," or I feel like I've almost always sort of been the same person. I feel like I've always kind of dressed the same and had the same haircut and sort of behaved the same way. And like, I'm pretty competitive and I like to compete, and I'm a pretty friendly person and pretty outgoing. Yeah. I think I did myself a disfavor by not being more studious. Maybe like because school, I could just sort of get by. I know more, like my sister has 3 boys that are great students, and I never applied myself in any way, shape, or form like those 3 have, so that's one thing I wasn't. But I mean, I was competitive about grades. Yeah, I was pretty outgoing.
'Cause
Same. Everybody was. There wasn't that many shy kids, and I think that we would sort of embrace the ones that were and sort of like kind of bring them in. Um, there was, yeah, and I had quite a few friends growing up, and then when I went to high school, I had friends, and but I was one of my best friends when I was 13 was Steve West, who's the drummer for Pavement. Yeah,
right.
and he was musically inclined. His family got him a drum kit when he was 12 or 13, and then he would have played his first ever gig on our back deck for my sister's 16th birthday party. He was in a band called The Sellers with a bunch of my friends from high school, and they just played a bunch of covers like Can't Explain by The Who. And Steve West himself was really into the Doors, and he could do, for a 14-year-old, he could do a pretty ripping Jim Morrison impression. That was sort of his first rock and roll hero, his first like icon. He became a master at drawing the Doors in that script they use, he would almost probably graffiti that to an extent. But he was musically inclined, and a lot of my friends' work is John Smith and Rob Williams and Hamby Carter. They were always a band. They became a pretty successful band in Richmond called Contu Cook Line later on, and they moved to New York. And then, fortunately, being from Richmond, we had a lot of great touring bands that would come through of the punk rock variety. A lot of the SST bands and Discord. There was sort of a Richmond versus DC punk rivalry going on. We'd get all the DC bands. We'd get, and keep in mind, we're on I-95. So it's always been a great place for bands to stop and play. And there's always been clubs. I mean, when I was a kid, there was Hard Times Cafe, Going Bananas, Rockets, New Horizons Cafe, which was kind of like a reggae place in the main, but I saw Squirrel Bait there and the Descendants and stuff. And there's just really cool things to do. Schaefer Court and VCU's campus would have like all ages matinee things that were free. But the biggest thing for me was Plan 9 Records. And me and my late friend, Nordy Horde, we would shop for records there. And that's what made me cool, man.
Two things. One, I love the names of all your childhood friends. They are fantastic names.
Yeah, they were great guys. I'm still in touch with some of them in varying degrees.
And the other thing is, I think it's really interesting. The school I went to, there were. I'm a little younger than you, but I think by the time, by the later 80s, it feels like schools were got very stratified in terms of your interests. There were the stoners. There, it was really a classic, every kind of movie where you see someone pan across a cafeteria. There were the groups, there were the jocks, and obviously it's not completely stratified in terms of I had friends that were on the football team, and I had friends in all the different kinds of corners. But I do think it's interesting that you played sports, you were very competitive, and also you were into punk, SST, Black Flag or whoever, Husker Du, whoever else was touring through, and whoever's on Discord.
We had Honor Roll in Richmond too. See, we had a punk rock band that I probably saw at least 50 times. That sort of blew my mind. And that Bob Schick worked at the record store. And Richmond was a good, no, I think in my case, I was very fortunate because when I was in middle school, public middle school, which is only a mile or so from where we lived, I got sort of kicked out of 8th grade and under really just ridiculous circumstances. And my sister had already started to go to this school. It was a private school called Trinity that was closer to the city. And it was sort of started by hippies in the mid 70s. And the really snobbier upscale prep schools in the town, which were St. Christopher's and St. Catherine's and Collegiate, where Russell Wilson went to school. They would sort of refer to Trinity as the public school you pay to go to, and which is kind of sneering and awful. But Trinity, where I went, had like about 60 or 70 students per class. And even if people had wildly different interests, they all sort of got along. It was a very amicable environment. And so that sort of benefited me. And sort of you didn't get what you're referring to. You didn't get like pigeonholed. Like everybody was sort of a nerd, and everybody played sports, and everybody was. I mean, some people were artistically inclined, and some people weren't, and stuff like that. But everybody hung out together. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I think that sort of helped me in terms of like kind of keeping a pretty open mind about what people did as preteen and teenagers.
I mean, you seem pretty good natured. How does that play off of being competitive? Because I think I'm very competitive too. And at some point I had to kind of like push that down because it overpowered I would get too competitive, and it overpowered my being nice to other people.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of that has to do with tennis for me. I played a lot of team sports in my life, and it was very frustrating to be on teams and like deal with that sort of classic thing with the coach's son. So the coach's son gets to play, even though he's not very good and stuff like that. So at a very young age, I became very serious about tennis, and I sort of achieved more in tennis than any other sport. And Richmond, where Arthur Ashe is from, is a tennis town. And one thing that I really loved about tennis is you're just alone out there on an island when you're playing singles. And then when you're doubles, you have a doubles partner that you get along with really well. You sort of play as one. So you can only really blame yourself if you lose and fail. And it's a tremendous psychological game where you can be of inferior talent at the age 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And then when you get to be a little bit older, you do get sort of overpowered by better players. But and that's actually kind of the first experience that I had with touring as well. Like I traveled all around the state, the Mid-Atlantic area, playing tennis tournaments. So I think tennis was a really good introduction in that it made me a competitive person, but I also had to exercise good sportsmanship as well. So if you misbehaved, it was, and a lot of people did, you just get so frustrated. It's so hot and humid there too. And you would just get sort of overwhelmed. And I just think, keep in mind, like my idols at the time were people like the, relentlessly competitive psycho that John McEnroe was.
Right.
And I play tennis left-handed. I'm fairly ambidextrous person, but I'm one of those people that's like, my left side is my coordination side and my right side is power. So I actually bat right-handed, but I play tennis left-handed. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it was just like, yeah, while you're out there on the court competing, just like a lot of people, I mean, not everybody has to be a dick all the time, like Djokovic, I mean, I think Nadal is a really, really lovely person off the court, as far as I can tell. And Federer always seems like a gentleman as well. But then you get those guys on the court, and they wouldn't be where they were if they weren't some of the most cutthroat competitors in the world. So I think just playing tennis sort of changes all that. And it was just a great thing to have growing up. I was fit then too.
Yeah. I remember those days.
Yeah.
Were your parents competitive people?
Yeah. My father was a great athlete. My father played college football at Colgate. He would have played against Jim Brown 4 times. He played baseball, basketball, football, ran track. I think he was set out to play multiple sports at Colgate, and he was he was so good at football. He played both ways, offensive and defensive end, that the coaches pulled him aside and kind of demanded that he not play baseball, or basketball. He played freshman basketball and freshman baseball because they didn't want him hurting himself. And back then, Colgate used to play a really tough schedule. They used to play Syracuse and Army, who were both in the top 5. All the Ivy League schools were really good at football. And it was tough because a lot of times they'd get overmatched. And the other end was a guy named Al Jamison, who was a huge guy from Texas. And he became a star for the Houston Oilers. My father actually was drafted. Not drafted, but the way it worked back then is you got offers, you got letters, he got offers from the New York Titans and the New York Giants to play football in the NFL, but there was just no money in it. He actually could make as much money and not risk his body, because keep in mind, like it was no genius that invented the face mask. I mean, the guy, I've seen so many pictures. My father broke his nose 11 times playing football. He had this massive nose, and there's so many pictures of him with playing football with a leather cap on. He had on top of his skull, he had an actual sort of soft spot, almost like, it's kind of a grim thing to describe, but it was almost like, and God knows how many concussions he'd had, but it was almost like opening up a cottage cheese container and putting your hand in it almost,
Oh, no.
And that's just from playing on both sides of the ball for so many years. And my mother was actually, was the worst athlete in my family. My sister was a state champion quarter miler, and my mother was a fantastic high jumper. See, I come from sort of a really athletic family, and my father was an absurd competitor. We still sort of make jokes about it. Like, we're all really shitty at golf. I think my sister's probably the best. And the few times that we played golf in my life, my father would we'd be playing a really sort of lousy par 3 course. And my father would line up a putt like he was playing the 16th hole of the Masters on Sunday or something. It was ridiculous, we're each 15 over par at this point, so we were just a certain kind of pathetic at golf, which is fine with me because, the white male is at his absolute worst in the 19th hole of the golf course. There's no doubt about that. But I'm
imagining him just yelling shh, I'm trying to do the shot.
Yeah. No. We just had to stand away from him because he would get pissed off, and he was ridiculous to play tennis against because his strokes were so crude, but he was just absurd. So I got a lot of it from him. In fact, I was very much self-taught. I was sort of resistant to taking lessons, and that sort of hurt me in the end. I mean, I got recruited to play college tennis, and one of the reasons why I went to Virginia is because it was kind of all I had done from age 10 to 17. And I wanted to at that point, I was more into music. I was more into buying records. My friend Nordy and I had a radio show. We were the only high school kids with a radio show at University of Richmond. And I was all out and really interested in getting a radio show at WTJU in Charlottesville, which I did. And Charlottesville was great too, because bands would come through there all the time, and we had this guy Maynard Sipe that I would hang flyers up for in the dorm so I could get into the shows for free. But there was a lot of cool stuff that came through there, and there was cool bands from Charlottesville. So they're very fortunate in that regard.
I mean, by the time you're going to college, do you have other career aspirations, or are you just do you think you're going to play tennis professionally after that?
No, I never thought. I think up until the age 15, I fancied the idea that I would be playing in the French Open someday. And when you get to be 16 or 17 and you haven't sort of improved that much over the last 2 or 3 years, and like guys that used to sort of beat easily, now you're sort of struggling against, and you just you just sort of you get kind of blown off the court. And I was still very competitive, but I kind of realized at 15, 16 that I never was going to be a pro. And I kind of knew what was required of being a pro because several of the guys I played against went on to be pretty serious pros. And there's a lot of women in Richmond. Kathleen Cummings, she would have made the quarterfinals of Wimbledon. And the small high school I went to had the best girls tennis team in the country. I mean, we had Valerie Farmer was the state women's champion at 16. I think like the girl that was like number 6 was number 6 in the state. So it was, the girls team was better than the boys team. And I was 1 or 2 on the boys team. But I just figured that by the time I got to be 17, that tennis was sort of over. And I went to Charlottesville and I played in an intramural tournament the first couple of weeks I was there. And it was like a draw of 256 I'm pretty sure it was 256. I made it to the semis. And if you won it, then you sort of got an offer to walk on to the team. And if I would have played tennis at UVA, I would have made the team, but I don't know if I would have ever made the top 6. The guy that played number 1 the years that I was there was a guy named Carl Clark, who I played once when I was 17, and I think he beat me in 3 sets. So, I mean, I wasn't too far behind him, but I just was getting, once you sort of go from age 13, 14, if I'd gone to a smaller, I think I would have definitely played for Colgate. I could have gone there. I could have gone to William and Mary. I could have played there. But I just kind of wanted to do something else. And I guess I didn't realize at the time, but I guess that was like kind of drinking beer and going to see bands and buying records. Sort of took up way too much of my time while I should have been going to class. And I drove a bus. I got a job driving a bus in Charlottesville for the University Transit Service. That was sort of my gig. And I washed dishes in a lot of different restaurants. And I worked at the record store. So yeah, I gave up on the idea at 15 or 16 that I was ever going to be good enough than anything but above average college player.
Was that rough? Because like I've talked to a number of people. This seems to happen particularly to people who are who play sports. I've talked to someone who like thought they were a couple people who like were on their way to play professional basketball, and at some time, either like at age 16 or 17, they realized their limits. And that's a really I think that's a really difficult lesson when you're a teenager. Like I didn't have to start learning those lessons until like, I don't know, my late 20s, maybe my early 30s is like, I didn't start running up against like, I'm not going to be this thing. Like, I'm not going to be Bob and I'm not going to be Mr. Show or whatever. Right.
Right.
There's certain things that I'm just not going to be. And I think it's really difficult to like learn that lesson at like 16.
Yeah. It's part of life, I mean, that's the thing is like, that's the thing about tennis or basketball or, you can be a big fish in a little pond, which I never was because Richmond was incredibly competitive with tennis at the time. And so there was always somebody better than you. So there was always somebody better than me, and I tried my best. I tried my absolute best, but it's just a classic case of, you can go pretty far and it makes sense that you beat these people, but no, it wasn't difficult. To me, it was sort of logical. And to me, it was just sort of maybe I saved myself some time by realizing that I sucked when I was 16. I mean, you get down on yourself a little bit, but like, that's the way it is. Life goes on, it's like you tried your best at something and you've got a couple of small trophies instead of large ones to show for it. I mean, that kind of thing.
I mean, you seem very emotionally healthy then, right? It seems like you grew up in a household where it's just like you tried your best, and as long as you tried your best, that was that was the point, trying your best, striving.
Yes. I had, I'm one of those people that had, I came from my immediate family was very, very tight, very close. There's just three of us now. We're still incredibly close and good friends. So it was a very healthy environment. My father was one of those people because of his job. He was there 2/3, 3/4 of the time. And my mother, she was always there. So yeah, no, I'd say like, all credit goes to her and my father. I have a wonderful older sister, so I'm incredibly blessed in that regard.
When you're okay, so you came from what, like a pretty middle class background?
Just I'd say we went from lower middle to upper middle throughout the course of my life. I think when I was born in 1967, we would have been lower middle class, and then my father just he worked incredibly hard. He retired at 59, and as soon as he was eligible, and at the time, my sister just had her first son. She has 3 boys, and he retired because I think really what he enjoyed most about the last 15 years of his life was retirement and having 3 grandsons. So he told me on many occasions, not many occasions, but a few occasions, that when Mary and myself, it's my sister, when we were kids, he really couldn't enjoy us as much as he would have liked because he had to work so hard. And my father was a labor relations guy. And so on the behalf of the company, he would have to negotiate contracts with labor unions. And he comes from a poor working class background. So even though he was representing the company, he was incredibly well liked by the unions because he was always out to give them a fair deal. And as part of that, he took a fair amount of abuse from the mid-level executives just above him, and he really resented that. And there's a lot of people that he worked for that were mid-level and then the ivory tower, and he heavily disliked a lot of these people. And that was actually from a very young age, hearing my father call executive guys assholes and son of a bitch and that kind of thing. I would say that throughout the course of my life, my parents, they did what, they worked really hard and they did well, My mother, they both had been school teachers to start. My father got his master's from Colgate. My mother went to Cortland State, which is they both no way would have gone to university in any way, shape, or form if they hadn't gotten full scholarships. My mother got a New York State Regent scholarship. I think there was only a handful of those given every year. There's, nobody else from her family went to college. And my father has 2 siblings, and he was the only one that went to college. And they just were sort of determined to make something of themselves, And when you're a kid, you don't realize what's going on. But we always had nice houses. And then the house that my mother would have sold a few years ago, which was the house that we had the longest in South Richmond, was a house that they had built. That house on Commodore Point Place in Midlothian was sort of like where they intended to retire. And I think where they did for as long as they could be there. And then it just sort of became impractical for my mother to be out there by herself a few years ago. So,
I mean, I asked that because, I think about it seems like we came from pretty similar backgrounds, economic backgrounds.
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it always seems like a risk, unless you come from like an elite background. It always seems like a risk to do something in the arts, playing music or, making art, doing comedy, whatever it is. It always feels risky. And I'm curious if it felt risky for you. Because, you same thing. Like I had day jobs, all up until, a couple years ago. And
Yeah, I started working when I was a kid. The first job I had was sweeping the tennis courts. We had clay tennis courts at the club near where I grew up, and then I was a bus boy, and I always had jobs. But yeah, no, in terms of arts and stuff like that, the thing that happened with me and pavement was just pretty absurd in a lot of ways. Like my parents never. I had to like really sort of explain to them in the early 90s when we sort of put down what we were doing and realized that we weren't going to work day jobs anymore. And in 92, after Slade and Shannon came out, we were going to be a touring band. And I remember even in 90 and 91, when we did brief tours, the East Coast, my mother couldn't really wrap her head around the idea that it made sense to her because she'd see me going to see bands and heard horrible sounding music come out of my bedroom for years. But it didn't make any sense to her that she would be like, well, what do you do what do you mean? What do you get up on stage? What do you do? Because they tried to have me do piano lessons and I showed no acumen. I remember that somebody trying to teach me how to play violin at some point. They were so annoyed with me, they would pinch my fingers really hard. And then I remember even in Connecticut in 5th and 6th grade, there was a marching band at the school I went to, North Stratford or North Stratfield, I think it was. And the drumming instructor was a guy named Mr. Fink. And he had a really thin mustache. He was sort of a really unusual guy. And there was like you had just like this wooden thing with like a piece of like an inner tube that you would hit. And like, there was like 8 drummers in the band and 4 of them knew how to kind of play like kind of a fancy beat. And I was one of the 4 who just did this, cause
1, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah. Cause I was just like sucked at it. And so it's just pavement is one of those unusual situations for me where I was just cut out to like only be, and I was really good friends with Steven and, became fast friends with Mark and Scott and Gary, that they were really sort of comfortable with me being like, the only roadie. And then days before our first gig, when I first met Gary Young, it became very clear to Malkmus that he would not be able to completely rely on Gary to keep time. So that's how I actually ended up in the band. So those first couple of years before 92, I had very little to do if he was on his game. I was I was just there as an insurance policy to make sure that there was some sort of like beat being played. So my skills were really rudimentary. And it's sort of interesting. I'm one of those musicians that still to this day, people will sort of ask me to do things hey, do you want to jam with us? Or do you want to do this stuff like that? And like people don't realize that I can really only play Pavement and Silver Jews songs. And my father was just, he loved it because my father loved coming to the shows. He saw dozens of Pavement shows and he'd be in the front row. He just had an absolute blast. And my mother was like, hold on, how are you in the band? Because she'd never seen me. My parents had never seen me play music in any way, shape, or form. And then they would sort of come to the shows and they'd see us do what we did, which, believe me, was real hit or miss. And I remember like in the mid 90s, like Pavement sort of gradually becoming more and more sort of professional.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother being sort of really impressed with how far we had come, because she'd seen gigs from the early days that were just a complete shambles. And I think throughout the course of Pavement, when you play hundreds of live shows, and I was terrified the whole time. I mean, like I'm an anxious person to begin with. I remember touring with bands that had virtuoso musicians in them. And we toured with a band called High Llamas that had a guy that played xylophone and vibraphone that was like not only classically trained and went to the famous school for music in London, but he was like, generally considered one of the best in the world. I remember touring with Stereolab, and there was this woman named Catherine who played keyboards for Stereolab. And I couldn't have played the keyboard parts for Stereolab. And she was a classically trained pianist, and she was so incredibly bored having to play her Stereolab. So like every single time I personally took the stage in Pavement, I was terrified of screwing it up. And I think that energy, that nervous energy, was sort of really beneficial to me from a performance perspective. But no, growing up as a child and as a teen, I listened to records and I saw a hell of a lot of bands. And so I think that I have always had pretty interesting taste in music, but the idea, I was always very comfortable being somebody in the audience. And the idea of getting up on stage was just sort of propelled by need and the fact that, Malcolmus is insanely talented. Gary is an incredibly gifted drummer. Scott had always played guitar. He's good. And Ibold was sort of more like me. He had been in bands, but he was sort of learning as he went along too. So like throughout the course of Pavement, he got to be a better bass player. And then when he carried on to play in Sonic Youth, same sort of thing, but he had to practice really hard.
Yeah.
So it was interesting how it all worked. Steve West, as I mentioned before, he started playing drums when he was 12 or 13, and just a very solid drummer. So like, no, there's no way anybody like me. People are like, oh, I don't write songs. I mean, I've written a few songs in my life. They're completely absurd. It is funny. People ask me to do things. Even just the other night, there's a band called Boat from Washington State. They got in touch with me and they wanted me to do the background vocals on Monster Mash. So I can do things like that,
I do think it's interesting though. Like, this is my theory on like what I'm calling good bands. All right. Or unique bands. Right. I think that they come out of a confluence of a bunch of different kind of like maybe even contradictory things, either styles or personalities or whatever. And then it is at the crossroads of all those things that the uniqueness of the band comes out. And I think, Pavement is not Pavement without you, right? Do you know what I mean? Like,
I think so, because I think that, most bands don't have somebody that can't play in them. I think also I've heard a lot of people say over the years that Pavement's the band that they saw that made them realize that they could be a band too. And a lot of that might come from watching me. Because, I just played tambourine, maracas, egg shakers, all different kinds of percussion stuff. Anybody can scream. Okay. Anybody can. Okay. It's kind of fun to put your heart into it. And then in my case with keyboards and samplers and stuff like that, anybody can make noises on a Moog. Okay. And sometimes you get lucky and they sound really cool. But like, as I said, I feel like towards the end of Pavement, and then we got to get back together in 2010, I think there's actually been a few nights in my life where I actually felt kind of musical and felt like a musician. But to answer your question, I think that, yeah, it's good to have sort of this tension of, and it's incredibly difficult at any genre of rock and roll to be original. Okay. So like, and Pavement wears its influences on our sleeves. There's no doubt about that. There's dozens of them, dozens. And I think that's the case. I think that's actually a benefit of ours is that we pretty much, Gary included, we've always been really, really avid music listeners. So yeah, like you can peg down certain songs that very much sound like The Fall and Swell Maps from the early days, and songs that have sort of an REM feel, and songs that have like a Sonic Youth feel, or even like our contemporaries like Sebadoh. We've got songs that, certain songs that sound like them. There's, prog rock influences and stuff like that. But at the same time, like when you talk about the personnel on stage, I think it was really important in our case, and hopefully set us apart, that we always seem like a band that our audience kind of like rooted for, almost like a sports team. Like they wanted us to succeed, like, because there was always sort of they wanted it to be a good show and be a special show. And when it was, I think there was a little bit of surprise. I think that anybody that's seen Pavement play a lot of shows has probably seen good ones and ones that weren't so good, but like, as I said, in the second half of the 90s, I think we did get admirably consistent. But no, I mean, and again, I made the set list and stuff like that, so I kind of swing it to sort of complement, kind of what I wanted to do. And sort of, Malkmus uses so many different tunings and stuff. You had to do the set list, because otherwise you can't have the guitar tech changing tunings. We didn't want to be one of those bands where, like, for several years, everybody would just play out of tune. But then, like, as we got like to a certain level, we always had such a minimal crew of brilliant people. Like, we just have one guitar tech, one sound man. For the first time in 2010, I was like, that we had a monitor engineer, who's a really nice guy named Jeremy. And I was like, he said, he came over and introduced himself before the tour started as the monitor engineer. And I just told him, I said, you know what? I mean, like, help the other guys, because I'm so deaf. I can't really hear it. I can't hear the thing. It doesn't matter whether I have one or not. But I said, just put Malkmus in there, because he's on the other side of the stage. So I sort of know what song he's playing, So that's the way it was. So yeah, in order to, like, when you have this thing, and we never practiced very often. There's a lot of unique things about that band. We never practiced. We never lived anywhere near each other, aside from the era in which we were both in New York, that kind of thing. But yeah, strange band. And really happy that people liked it a lot. I mean, it was a hell of a lot of fun. We're so fortunate that, those guys can make good songs, and that people really enjoyed it.
I mean, literally changed my life. I don't say that lightly. Like, if it's one of those, like, finding Crooked Rain in 9th grade, changed my perspective on things and probably set me off on the direction I'm on now.
Oh, cool. That's good.
Whether that's good, awesome. Whether that's good or not,
I mean, there are worse records. Like, it could have been like Queensryche or something like that, I guess, or.
No, but I mean, I like my life,
so I'd say.
But like I mean, how do you end? So like at what point are you like, oh, I'm going to be playing music? Like, you're in college. You are like, what are you doing in college exactly? Like, when do you meet?
Well, this was after college. Yeah, no, I met Malkmus when we were both college radio DJs, and he's a year older than me. So I met him pretty early on. His first year roommate, by coincidence, came from the small high school in Richmond that I did. His name was Ken West, no relation to Steve West. And he introduced me to Malkmus, because Malkmus was from Stockton, and he didn't really have that many like-minded friends. So my year sort of had more people like Steve that were into the same kind of weird shit. And Steve and I were sort of unique in that, in addition to being, into the music that we were into and the records that we were into, and going to see bands, going to see shows, whether it be in Charlottesville, Richmond, DC, New York, wherever. We had that in common, but we were also really devout sports fans. Me, I'm sick, but I mean, he's pretty over the top too. The guy's brilliant. Steven's one of those people that if he's not really good at it, he won't do it. Yeah, I don't know if you, but yeah, maybe he's just good at everything. I mean, it doesn't bother me because he just sort of takes it in stride, but he's good at stuff. Okay. And we also started playing a lot of Scrabble together. But he joined our clique because his year there was a bunch of us. There's a few dozen of us. And so we embraced him at UVA, and he was just always really cool. I mean, like I got along with him from day one. And we haven't had that many bad days really. But yeah, no, I didn't realize that I was going to be playing. No, I was driving a bus to New York City when Pavement, 1991, it was just, all through those early records, the first 7-inch, Demolition Plot, J7, Perfect Sound Forever, all that stuff before Slanted. It was just a project. It was like a project for fanzines. There was a certain amount of an air of mystery over as regards to who we were. We were kind of being abused in New York City a lot as these like shitheads or lunkheads that came from like UVA to go to school or go to New York City. And we never were trying to be cool, but of course we're in the good record stores and at all the good gigs. That's why we moved there. You know what I mean? But so people kind of were pretty snide towards us until they realized that we were the guys in Pavement, Silver Jews, and the same sort of people that had been rude to us before were then suddenly quite nice to us, which I found kind of amusing, really. But I guess that's just the way it goes, it didn't bother me at all. I try not to be overly judgmental, but yeah, no, incredibly fortunate. Like just the strangest year of my life in 1992 to be working as a supervisor of a bus terminal on the west side of New York City and be able to go in one day and take all of my bus driving uniforms, lay them on a desk and walk out of there. And then a few weeks later, find myself in, Derby, England, playing a show in front of 300 English kids who knew every word to Summer Babe. I mean, it was just, it was just sort of unbelievable transition. From 92 on, I was not even 25 years old. And I never thought that I'd be able to make any kind of living or do anything being in a band until then. And then, Pavement sort of gradually got bigger, and it was very gradual. And it was something that we could, were very comfortable with. And we were working with really great people.
All right. Two questions left. One,
fantastic.
Bus driving in New York. What was that like? Because that seems like a difficult job.
First of all, it was the excuse I gave to move to New York. I mean, not that many parents in the world are going to be too happy or too impressed by financing their child graduating within a Bachelor of Arts in American government from the University of Virginia, and then their aspiration is to go to New York City to drive a bus. In my case, I did so under the auspices that I would be writing a book about such an experience, which was always fairly dishonest. I just wanted to be there for the scene and the music. And I knew I could sort of pay my way doing that. So my first job there was loading tractor trailers at Newark Airport for UPS. And that was incredibly difficult. That was 7 weeks of hell, 6-hour shifts, so physical, literally covered from head to toe in bruises and cuts. And I'd have to ride these like kind of illegal $1 vans. We lived in a pretty bad neighborhood in Jersey City, me, David, and Steven, when we first moved there. And so when I got the bus driving job a few months into my stint there, it was a real pleasure. I really enjoyed the challenge, and it was sort of a really great way to see New York, because you're just, you're high enough off the ground where you can see anything. So the things that I saw, I saw in Hell's Kitchen, which I'd have to drive to on just about every route. I saw New York City police officers being filleted by hookers in Hell's Kitchen from my bus window. One time I saw a woman in a dress, lift her dress and take a shit right on the sidewalk in Rockefeller Center. I was off service and I was returning to the lot late at night. I really enjoyed working at night because I enjoyed working from 3 p.m. till midnight, because then you get off at midnight in New York City, and that's when things are sort of back then sort of kicking into high gear. That's sort of one thing that's really sort of, obviously everything's different this year, but like, let's just talk about 2019. Things happened really late at night in New York for decades. And I think Giuliani changed all that. So I kind of got in like at the tail end of like, New York City being kind of a dangerous and gritty place that had like kind of a large art and music community. Hoboken was fantastic, but no, I love driving a bus in New York. I was very aggressive. I was sort of determined to maintain my schedule. I had several accidents, 7, I believe, 2 of which were my fault. I ran over a parked New York City police car and destroyed it, right in Pershing Square by Grand Central Station. That was a bad day. You got to keep in mind that I was the only person out there who would be like at like CB's at like 3:15 in the morning, and then at 6:40 I'd be in a bus driving uniform driving a bus. So I was irresponsible, and I guess thankfully got away with it. I definitely used up a lot of luck. I shouldn't have done many of the things that I did, but I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed those few years. I saw some amazing things. I didn't mean to mention 2 of the more lewd things, but it was really a great way to. It was a great introduction to the city.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, like my 2 best friends at the Stephen and David were both, and Steve West. They were all 3 security guards at the Whitney Museum. The Modern Art Museum, American Art Museum in New York. And they pretty much all 3 like got a full on art history education. So like I'm getting an education on the streets of New York, and these guys are getting like a full on, like, it was a major revelation for all 3 of them. I think that many Pavement and Silver Jews lyrics were penned in the Whitney while these guys are guarding like Rauschenberg and that kind of stuff. So it was just, your early 20s are supposed to be amazing, and mine weren't. I love my job, but it was challenging. It was, and I made it challenging because I wasn't going to miss anything on the account that I had to turn around and go to work at 6 a.m, and so yeah, bad behavior. Bad behavior.
All right. Last question then. When does horse racing come into your life? Because I'm really curious. It's such a passion. I think the last time I saw Pavement was on the Brighten the Corners tour in Philadelphia at the Trocadero. And you guys came out afterwards and were very nice to talk to us all. And that summer I was working at an off-track betting place in Pennsylvania.
Oh, were you?
I remember just you were so friendly, and we talked about horse racing.
Mm-hmm. Sorry about that.
No,
that's how I punish a lot of people. I would say, like, what really happened to me is like first of all, I'm from Richmond, and when I first moved there, as a young kid, six years old. The principal of our elementary school was Alan Chenery, who's Penny Tweedy's a cousin in marriage, I believe, of Penny Tweedy, who owns Secretariat. So Secretariat, the greatest horse ever from maybe in American history, but certainly from the state of Virginia. So I moved there at that time, and that sort of got my interest. So horse racing sort of became a real thing then. But then, like throughout my growing up years, and then so racing was on TV. We'd watch the big races and stuff like that. But I started to get really sick. I got the disease, and it's a tough disease to manage, gambling addiction. But when I was 18, two of my dear friends, Rich Walker, who's a brilliant mathematician, and Jeff Dukes, Rich approached horse racing with his incredible math mind that as a game that he could beat. And Jeff was just along for the ride. He's always up for fun. And we would drive hours up to this racetrack in West Virginia called Charlestown, and we would gamble and lose. We'd each have like $40. And that was sort of started me on the road. So 85. And then I got really into it when I was a bus driver in New York. It was a great way to make it through the bus driving day. Back then on WFAN, they would read the results of the New York Racing Association, whether it be Aqueduct, Belmont, or Saratoga. They'd read the results of the race every half hour. And I certainly was the only New York City bus driver that would illegally park my bus at the start of each run across in the third. I used to do cross down 34th a lot. There's no TB that was on like 31st and 2nd or something like that. And I would go place all my bets for the day. I would always have huge amounts of OTB cards. And then I would listen to the results. And then every day off, I would spend at the racetrack. I used to take the bus into Penn Station, and then I know what was that thing on the I can't remember the name of the place on the west side, the big bus terminal. Anyways, I would take a bus into there, and then I would ride the A train out to Aqueduct all the time. That's where I cut my teeth. And then by the time I moved to Louisville and eventually bought a house across the street from Churchill Downs, that's when the disease sort of had kicked into high gear. It sort of really was all consuming. And then I became a jockey agent early 2000s. But I think in 1997 was the first time that I bought a racehorse. And then I've actually bred 15. I think that was sort of the only thing that I have to brag about is that I'm the only American that's been to all 60 British race courses in person. Because I love British racing. I actually own a quarter share of a horse called Dear Alex, who's trained in England by John Barry at Newmarket. I'm pretty excited about him. It became part of my life when I started making my own money. That kind of thing. I get up every morning and I watch the British races and, Breeders' Cups next week. And it just, it's overwhelming passion of mine.
What is it that resonates with you about it? Like, what is it that really makes you excited?
To me, I've always loved sports, as you know. I've been watching. I came from a family of athletes. Sports, we didn't have ESPN when I was growing up until later on, but sports has just always been a big part of it. So as a sports fan, there's no more exciting sport to me than horse racing. It's just, and they're like Enable, one of my favorite horses of all time, who just retired recently. Seeing a horse like that, and following a horse like that, and seeing how incredibly marvelous she is. In fact, it's very interesting over the last decade plus, really the best racehorses in the world, all corners of the world, whether it be Winx in Australia, Zenyatta here, Rachel Alexandra, really the ones that have captured the imagination. Goldie Kova in France and Zarkova, and they've really been the mares. The fillies and mares have sort of really captured the hearts of racing fans. So, and it doesn't really, the quality ones are one thing, but horses are so much like human athletes. There's ones that just have all the tools, that are going to be like Mookie Betts, that are physically and mentally talented, and then there's some that are like really, really beautiful that have absolutely no excuse, but they don't try. And there's some that are like really ugly and unattractive and not well made and have major conformation faults, but they're really smart. They're all heart. And they try really hard, so they overachieve. With the great ones, they just generally have every tool. But some horses just completely win on all heart. So you sort of fall in love with that aspect. I mean, I've always tried to explain it to people that a 2-year-old racehorse is which is the youngest age that they race. A 2-year-old racehorse is like a high school athlete. And then 3-year-olds, which would be the Derby, the Triple Crown year, they're like college athletes. And we get to 4, 5, 6 and above, they're like pros. So when you have like an 8 or 9-year-old racehorse running around, they're long in the tooth. That's almost like a 40-year-old baseball player. But yeah, it's just a passion. They're just incredible for me to watch. And it was a really great aspect of pavement going all around the world and being able to not only go to so many race courses, but also to go to betting shops in Australia, New Zealand, so I just love the game. I love every aspect of it. And I just wish that, I think it's imperative that we take better care of our horses. And then in this country, I think that we need to figure out a way to handle the performance enhancing drug situation, because I think it's gotten a little out of control, or way out of control. And I think it's sort of sullied American racing over the last couple of decades, for me, quite a bit. I used to be a lot more passionate about American racing. I've sort of turned my attention more to European racing because they kind of run a cleaner game there. I just don't want to. I think the vets have too much control of American racing. I mean, Bob Baffert's one of the biggest cheats I've ever seen in my life, so, and he's been doing it for a long time, obviously I'm such a low rung guy on the horse racing thing. I can say whatever I want. You can't take any job away from an unemployed guy. So
Bob, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah. My pleasure. Yeah. Take care of yourself.
You too. Thanks. See ya.
Bio, 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 bio.